At number 10, Purity. Reduce your skill cooldowns by 2, but you are unlucky. Purity is an interesting item because it can enhance an already great build, or it can completely cripple it. It all depends on the build you're going for. This item is the foil to 57 Leaf Clover, where Clover rerolls every proc for a favorable outcome, Purity rerolls for an unfavorable outcome. However, you typically lose more from Purity than you gain from Clover. Clover can be a nice boost, but it's very rarely a necessity for your build. Where Clovers are a nice boost to proc, bleed, and crit builds, Purity just destroys them. One tri-tip is a 10% bleed chance, but if you have a Purity, it's a 1% bleed chance. If you have Purity, say goodbye to your hard-earned bleed, crit, needle tick, tentabobble, stickies, ATGs, ukes, polyloops, and perforators, because they lose 70 to 90% of their value. And you can forget about proc chains. There are some advantages here though. For one, since proc builds die with one Purity, there's not much of a consequence for stacking them. You kind of get the negative effect on the first stack, but for subsequent stacks, the drawback is kind of irrelevant. Bleed and crit are also not entirely out of the equation. If you max crit and bleed to 100%, Purity will have no effect on it. If you're guaranteed to crit on every attack, it doesn't matter how many times it's rerolled. With 10 lens makers, you can have a million Purities and it won't make a difference. Same thing with bleed, except on some survivors you will need more than 10 daggers to get to 100%. It's also important to remember proc items are not the end-all be-all of damage. Purity might lower your crit, but it won't affect crowbars, watches, focus crystals, or armor-piercing rounds. You will also still have access to bands, a very strong build type. But this is just to cover the negative effect. With a few Purities, you'll be able to spam the bazinga out of your abilities, which should help make up for some of this damage loss. Or in Artificer's case, completely break the final boss. Overall, Purity is a very situational item. It can either be amazing or horrible, but it is far from being the worst Lunar. At number 9, Strides of Heresy. This is one of the heretic items. It replaces your utility skill with Shadow Fade. Become intangible and gain 30% plus movement speed and heal for 18% of your maximum health, lasting 3 seconds. Now, I'll admit, this ability is OP as hell. This ability literally makes you invincible. On paper, it is objectively an amazing item and doesn't belong here, and on paper, it's one of the best Lunars. But Risk of Rain 2 is not a spreadsheet, and while this item is good, it comes at the cost of making your survivor feel horrible. The other Heresy items do this too, but I think this one feels worse to use because the utility slot is usually reserved for a mobility skill. It's weird playing Merc without the dash, Huntress without the blink, Railgunner without the mine, Loader without the punch. It just detracts so much from how these characters feel. You have these beautifully crafted kits for each survivor with really tight controls, probably the strongest aspect of the game. Now, just take out their most defining move and replace it with an ability that's sluggish and boring to use. Stacking this item just makes it last longer, which is technically good, but also kind of sucks because there's no way to cancel out of it. You have to sit through the full animation every time you use it. Compare that to something like Merc's Dash, where it's 1 second, you get out of danger, and deals damage. Technically a worse ability, but it feels infinitely better. That's kind of all I have to say with this one. It's very much a personal gripe. I should also mention, because I know it's going to be confusing to people, a few of the items on this list were also on my best Lunar items list, and there's a few reasons for that. One, there just aren't that many bad Lunars. I'm looking at the worst case scenario for these items, but also Risk of Rain 2 is not a linear game. The best item in one run can be the worst in another. It's like trying to rank rock, paper, scissors. It's far from a perfect system, so just keep that in mind. At number 8, Defiant Gouge. Using a shrine summons enemies nearby. Very simple item. I don't have a lot to say about this one, but I do know that a lot of people seem to dislike it. I don't really mind it. I actually kind of like it in the early game. A lot of times the early game can feel like a slog. Every run has that period where you're just standing around waiting for enemies to spawn with not much else to do. Gouge can speed up the early game quite a bit, and it gives you something to do. The problem with this item comes later in stages 4 and 5. Hitting a shrine, getting nothing, and then having 5 Elder Lemurians spawn on top of me makes me want to go to the rope store. I think after this though, Gouge goes back to being fine. If you head to the moon, you don't have to deal with any more shrines, so it does nothing. Or if you loop your run, a ton of powerful enemies are going to be spawning all the time, and you'll be strong enough to where you can deal with them, and a few extra enemies won't make a meaningful difference. Gouge is definitely not an amazing item, but it's one I don't have a huge issue with. At number 7, Visions of Heresy. Obviously, this is another one of Heretic's items. This one removes your primary and replaces it with Hungering Gaze. This ability fires a flurry of tracking shards that detonate after a delay. You get 12 charges, and all 12 charges recharge together on a 2-second cooldown. Stacking this item increases the charges by 12, but increases the cooldown by 2, which doesn't really increase your damage output unless you have something like brain stocks. Stacking it usually just locks you into a longer cooldown, not really worth it in my opinion. This item is good for a few survivors, notably the melee ones like Acrid and Loader. I don't really like it on Mercenary, but it can be okay. One survivor I do love this on is Engineer. Engineer's primary is just the worst. What even is this reticle? It looks like a cry for help. This attack is so inaccurate and awful. I hardly ever use it on Engie, and it's his primary ability, so swapping it out is a good change. Now it does change the primary on the turrets too, which I'm not a huge fan of for the stationary turrets, but I think it's a very necessary change on the carbonizer ones because I think their biggest flaw is they lack range. Visions fixes that issue. For most survivors, this ability is usually pretty bad, and you're usually better off with the regular primary, but for a few of them, it does have its uses. The wonders of the internet, such a marvelous time we live in. I remember back in the day when computers used to take up the size of whole rooms, but with all the modern marvels come some dangers. That's where today's sponsor, NordVPN, comes in. Back in my day, we didn't have to worry about hackers and data thieves, but nowadays, a good VPN is essential. NordVPN is the leading VPN service provider that helps keep your online activities safe and private. Now, I might be an old fuddy-duddy, but even I know the importance of securing your data, especially when using public Wi-Fi. It's just common sense. NordVPN encrypts your data so it stays safe from those cyber ruffians. And let me tell you, it's not just about security. NordVPN has some pretty nifty features as well. For instance, you can access region-locked content with ease. The other day, I wanted to watch an old British sitcom that I used to love as a boy, but it wasn't available here. With NordVPN, I switched my virtual location to the UK and enjoyed my show just like the good old days. Now, they say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but let me tell you, NordVPN is easy for even us old-timers to stay protected online. Plus, they have a special offer just for you young whippersnappers. 4 months free when you sign up for a 2-year plan. That's only 11 cents a day, and if it doesn't suit you, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee. So don't let the grass grow under your feet. Go to nordvpn.com/disputedorigin or click the link in the description. Thank you, Nord, for supporting the channel and keeping us all safe on the internet. As my grandfather used to say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. At number 6, Glowing Meteorite. Rain meteors from the sky, damaging all characters for 600% damage per blast. Last 20 seconds. This is the only lunar equipment on this list. Now, I'll give it credit. This item is amazing if you're trying to mess with your friends in multiplayer. It's also decent for prismatic trials, but in a normal run, it leaves a lot to be desired. The blasts only deal 600% a hit, which is decent, but still on the low side, especially for its 140-second cooldown, the longest cooldown in the game. I need to speak with the manager, these prices are ridiculous. This item also has the potential to hurt you. Granted, the meteors are very well telegraphed, but you still run the risk of getting hit every time you use it. There are so many better equipments in the game, and for the ridiculous 140-second cooldown, I expect something a lot more powerful. Prion is incredibly effective. It has amazing AoE and single target damage. It can clear out the entire teleporter for you in seconds, but this is balanced with its 2-minute cooldown. Glowing Meteor has an even longer cooldown, except its effect wasn't even that good in the first place. And that's really what kills it for me. If it had a 70-80 second cooldown, you might not have seen it on this list, but as it is now, I can never justify picking it up. Number 5, Corpse Bloom. Heal 100% more, all healing is applied over time. Can heal for a maximum of 10% of your health per second. This is an item I've mentioned a couple times on the channel. Last year I ranked it as the most underrated item in the game. I also put it in my best lunar items video. This is a really weird item to rank because it entirely depends on the difficulty. In Drizzle through Eclipse 4, it's an amazing item, but E5 and onwards, it's pretty bad. The way it works is pretty complex. It's doing 2 different things. One, your healing is doubled, pretty straightforward, but the secondary effect puts a limitation on how much healing you can access at once. Normally, if you activate a medkit, boom, instantly get that health back. But with Corpse Bloom, the healing is capped to 10% of your maximum health a second. Overall, I think this is a worthwhile trade. It gives you a ton of extra healing value, and as long as you're okay at avoiding enemies, the healing cap isn't that hard to deal with. The E5 modifier halves the effectiveness of all healing. In Corpse Bloom's case, it gets halved twice. First, the healing bonus itself is reduced from 100% to 50%, and more importantly, it also halves the healing cap to 5%. You're essentially getting an eighth of the value, and with every other healing item also being nerfed, that 50% extra healing doesn't go very far. Definitely the item hit hardest by Eclipse 5. That said, still has its uses, just not in every difficulty. At number 4, Beads of Felty, an item that basically does nothing. The placement of this item just goes to show you how good most lunar items are. Most of the items before this honestly aren't bad, literally better than an item that does nothing. Well, that's not entirely true. This item does let you fight the Twisted Scav in a moment fractured, which is cool for all 3 people that have done that. This is the only item blacklisted in Eclipse mode due to the Celestial Portal being disabled. Not really a ton to say about this one. Doesn't do much. It's nice to have if you ever encounter a cleansing pool for a free pearl, or if you're lucky in a radiant pearl. But yeah, that's Beads of Felty. That's about it. At number 3, we're getting into the actually bad items. Light Flux Pauldron. Have your cooldown, but have your attack speed as well. If you ever want to feel like you have 500 ping in single player, this is the item for you. At first, this might seem like a good deal. Attack speed isn't the most important stat in the game, especially for burst characters like Loader, Mercenary, and Artificer. Artificer especially seems like someone who'd benefit from this, as every single one of her abilities is cooldown based. But what is the point of having my cooldowns when a nanobomb takes this long to charge? You could get married, have a kid, send him to college, retire, and fucking die, all in the time it takes to charge one nanobomb. See, the problem with lowering attack speed is most abilities in the game have animations that scale with attack speed. This means a lot of attacks will have an obnoxious delay before you attack. Some attacks have end lag too. Captain's Shotgun demonstrates this really well. It's not good on burst characters, and proc characters like Commando are completely crippled by this. You can counteract the negatives by looking for attack speed, but remember, all attack speed is halved. That includes the items you pick up too, so you're looking at about 7 syringes to counteract its effect, which has a couple issues. One, that's a good amount of item real estate. You would be better off not taking Light Flux and instead investing those items into stuff like speed or damage, but there's also no guarantee you'll find a syringe printer, making it a pretty big gamble. There's just so many better options for the same amount of items, and outside of Loopterons, I haven't found it to be very useful. It's also important to note, if you're going for a build with bans, it doesn't matter how much cooldown reduction you have, bans are still going to be on a 10-second cooldown. Now, there is a character I do actually like this on, and that's Acrid. Acrid has a very passive playstyle, almost entirely relying on his poison. Being able to spit out twice as many epidemics is well worth it, especially since most of Acrid's moves don't have very much lag. Acrid's primary is hit pretty hard by it, making melee attacks ineffective, but I hardly use Acrid's primary past stage 3 anyway, so I don't think it's too much of a drawback, and the rest of his kit feels no different. Outside of Acrid though, this is horrible, and an item I hope I never have to use again. In the runner-up spot, I'm going to get some hate for this one. Number 2, Egocentrism. Every 3 seconds, gain an orbiting bomb that detonates on impact for 360% damage. Every 60 seconds, a random item is converted into this item. Now, I'll start with the positives. Now that that's out of the way, let's take a look at why this item blows chunks through a straw. This item corrupts everything you hold near and dear and turns it into pain and misery. My favorite thing about Risk of Rain 2 is its complexity. While on the surface it may seem like a casual game, if you play for long enough, you'll discover layers upon layers of complexity. Items synergize and counter each other. Mechanics like scrappers and printers give you the power to get the most out of your run. There are endless ways to improve at the game, but at its core, Risk of Rain 2 is about decision making. What items you choose to keep, what items you decide to scrap, and even the amount of time you spend on a stage are all decisions. So when you turn a bad run around into a good one, it feels earned, and that's what keeps me coming back to the game time after time. Ego makes all of that horseshit. Now, to be fair, there is some decision making involved with ego. The fact that an item gets corrupted every minute adds a sense of urgency to the run, but for the most part, it makes me feel like my decisions don't really matter. What's the point of scrapping a bison steak and turning it into speed if it's just going to be taken away from me either way? Benthic Bloom is another item that sort of does this, but at least there was a little bit more to it, with it only touching green and white items, and upgrading an item keeps it within the same category. Damage items upgrade into damage, healing upgrade into healing. You don't get anything like that with ego. I never find the orbs to help me whatsoever, and they're certainly not good enough for me to risk half the items in my build. Ego is awful in every sense of the word, but there's one item left that is somehow even worse. Ladies and gentlemen, the worst Lunar, scratch that, the worst item in the game, coming in at the number 1 spot, Stone Flux Pauldron. Double your health, but have your speed. This item makes Light Flux look good. When it comes to defense items, we have 3 categories. Healing lets you recover from damage taken, damage reduction lets you reduce the amount of damage taken, and mobility, which lets you avoid damage altogether. Mobility is by far the best of these. It's one of the first things to look out for in any run, and if you don't find any, you're going to end up taking a lot of hits that you could have otherwise avoided. For the hits you will inevitably take, damage reduction is next. You know what's a lot more effective than doubling your health bar? Having the amount of damage you take with 1 opal. Repulsion Armor will protect you from small hits, and Rose Buckler will slash the total amount of damage you take. When you fill your build up with mobility and damage reduction, you'll find you don't really need much healing. You will need some, but generally a few slugs will get the job done. The worst way to deal with damage is increasing your health bar. Bison Steak is a meme for a reason, guys. At the end of the day, there are so many better options. Stone Flux creates 5 new problems for every one it fixes. What good is a double-sized health bar when you're going to be taking 5 times more damage from the lack of mobility? Mobility items are also half as effective. It will take approximately 7 goat hooves just to get back to base speed, and base speed is already slow as it is. The benefit of this Lunar ends up being inconsequential most of the time, and the drawback is by far the worst of any Lunar in the game. Stone Flux, more like stone. Go away. Nailed it. Anyway, that's going to be it for today's video. This was by far the hardest ranking I've ever done, and that's just because there's not really a lot of bad Lunars. My rankings for the first 5 changed multiple times throughout this video, and it's far from perfect. To be honest, I don't know how many more of these I'm going to do. There's not a lot left to talk about, and it's probably time to switch it up a bit. That said, let me know in the comments if you have any ideas. But that's going to be all for me today. Thank you for my members for supporting the channel. You guys are the best. And extra big thank you to Kami, my editor. These videos would not be possible without them, and I'm really happy with how they've turned out. All right, I'll talk to you guys later. Ta-ta for now.